We are in the home tonight of Mr. Gordon Reese, 541 West 34th Street. And we have present two of Oklahoma's most distinguished citizens. Former Mayor George Shirk, who is also president of the Oklahoma Historical Society, and Major General Fred S Borum, who was commander of Tinker Air Force Base for many years. Mr. Shirk will interview General Borum.
Good evening. I'm George Shirk. The date is June the 10th, 1968, and it's my great pleasure to contribute my small part in seeing that our fellow Oklahoman, General Fred S Borum, is a part of the Living Legend Library. Good evening, General Borum.
Good evening, George.
I've known Fritz, as we affectionately call him in Oklahoma City, for a number of years. He probably was the most successful, most beloved by us local folks, commander that Tinker, originally the Midwest Air Depot, ever had. He served two terms. He retired as a Major General of the United States Air Force. Fortunately for us in Oklahoma City, he selected this as his home. General, where were you born, sir?
Winchester, Illinois.
I remember you have often told me about the early days there and that one-cylinder Cadillac that you used to have the chance of riding around in.
Yes, there's an old gentleman there by the name of George Goodhead who owned the private telephone system, and he bought a 1904 one-cylinder Cadillac, and he had to ship down to Winchester, and the old gentleman was rather elderly, couldn't crank it, so the young kids and boys around town would run along the side of him and crank the automobile for him to get a ride.
When did you move to Muskogee?
In 1905.
How old were you then, sir?
I think I was about 12 or 13 years old.
12 or 13. Were you always interested as a lad, I believe, in cars? I've heard you talk of so many of the old cars.
Yes, I was always interested in mechanical things, especially when the automobiles came into existence.
How far down from the east, along the Texas Road to the Katy, could people drive cars, folks that were coming down, say, from Missouri?
Well, about Bonita was about as far as the roads would permit them to travel safely. Most of the cars that coming to Oklahoma at that time are by Easterners, particularly in the men in the oil industry, oil business, from Ohio and Pennsylvania. And they drive their cars, try to drive them to Oklahoma rather, and they get about as far as Bonita, and that's where the roads ended, as far as getting the heavy cars down.
So you'd go up on the Katy and...
Well, I was working for a garage that one summer as a boy, and they sent me up on the Katy up to Bonita, and I loaded the car on a flat car and bring it on into Muskogee.
Would the people then come in the passenger train, or you'd be on the freight and they'd be in the passenger?
I'd ride it down on the flat car.
You remember some of the names of those old cars?
Oh, I remember the Winton and the Pope Toledo, Pope Hartford, Stoddard, Dayton. Mm-hmm. Oh, those are some of the heavier cars, the National, and of course the Buick.
Mm-hmm. In those days, Muskogee was the largest city in the state, wasn't it?
Well,
at least they thought so.
They thought so, anyway. I guess I know Oklahoma City probably.
Even before World War I. With the approach of World War I, I believe you've often told us that a friend of yours from Harlingen, Texas, is responsible for your entry.
Yes, Lon C. Hill Jr.
Lon Hill?
Yeah, Lon C. Hill Jr. was the fellow that really got me interested in the service. His father was opened up the Rio Grande Valley back down in the old days, and he used to come to Muskogee quite frequently, selling the land to the people around Oklahoma. And when the War I was declared there in April, why, he happened to be in Muskogee, and he asked me what I was going to do about the war situation. And are we going to be drafted, or are we going to enlist? And he suggested we better enlist and get into it and get in the aviation end of it, because that's the new branch. And that was going to be really the thing that's going to
And
have the most excitement to it.
in those days, wasn't that part of the Signal Corps?
Yes, it was part of the Signal Corps, U.S. Army Signal Corps.
And I think you mentioned that your friend, some of the Mexican War troops had camped on his father's.
Well, General Funston had camped down on his father's ranch during the Mexican work.
So you decided to get in the aviation section. I believe once you told me that your enlistment is dated August the 4th, 1917.
That is correct.
Where did you go, Fritz? To Texas somewhere?
I went enlisted in Fort Sam Houston.
And did they take you immediately, or did you come home?
I enlisted on August the 4th, and then I was told to go back to Muskogee, and they would call me when they were ready for me. And I'd been home about 10 days, and I had a call to report to the University of Texas, to the ground school, for ground school instruction, rather.
So
I left about 2 weeks, about the 1st September.
What you and I today would call basic training, you had at Texas.
That's correct.
And did you graduate from the ground
Yes,
school?
I graduated from ground school along the latter part of November
Of 1917.
1917, and was ordered to Kelly Field
For flight training?
for flight training.
I believe once you told me that you had to solo after 4 or 5 hours.
Yes, they.
How did that do that? How did that work then?
They about the limit on solo. If you didn't show signs of flying an airplane in 4 or 5 hours of instruction, you'd probably be sent back to the infantry.
What type of aircraft did you
It was
solo in?
JN-4D. That was a Curtiss with the OX-5 engine.
JN-4D.
Mhm.
Is that where the word Jenny comes from?
That's where the word Jenny is.
I never knew that. Jenny is because it was a JN model. Tell us about your early solos, your spirals and figure eights, and how did that work?
Well, of course, the instruction, as we look at it today, it would be very primitive. But they gave you about 4 or 5 hours of solo, and then 3 or 4 hours of dual, and then you'd have some cross country, and you had to complete your course in about 38 hours or less. That's about the limit. But in my particular case, I remember I was ordered up to, just when I'd gone over into solo work by myself. That's the first flight I'd taken actually by myself without an instructor with me. And I was told to go up and do figure eights around some silos about a couple of miles north of Kelly Field, and then go up to 2,000 feet and spiral down as if you were going to land, cut your engine back and so forth. I was up to 2,000 feet, all right, and I started down, and I looked up and I saw another airplane above me and one right below me, and it looked to me like I was getting pretty close to them, or they was getting too close for me, and I did something, of course, was all wrong. I let my foot slip around, I guess, watching these airplanes, pulled my stick back, and I went to what was known as a tailspin. We had no acrobatics in those days. We were taught acrobatics. I didn't know anything about them, and I didn't know how to come out of one of them. And more than I had been told that if you get in trouble, put everything in neutral. Put your rudder in neutral and put your stick in neutral. That I did, but it was too late. I hit the ground, and I folded up an airplane around my neck, and I came out alive, and that was pretty lucky, I have to say.
The aircraft, I guess, was demolished.
It was demolished.
Brooks Field.
No, that was a Kelly Field.
No, the man, the
well,
officer that Brooks Field was named for.
Where this happened was at Kelly Field, but Sid Brooks.
Sid Brooks.
Sid Brooks was a cadet about 2 weeks ahead of me. In other words, he had an accident, but he didn't get out of it. He was killed. And Brooks Field in San Antonio is named after Sid Brooks.
How many hours did you have in your course?
I had around about 38 hours.
And then were you commissioned?
I was commissioned second lieutenant.
In the Signal Corps?
The Aviation Section Signal Corps.
What was it, a Signal Corps insignia, the cross flags, like we know today in the Army?
No, we didn't wear the cross flags.
you were commissioned, I guess, in December of 1917.
The latter part of December.
Did you know Ed Stinson then?
Yes, I knew Eddie Stinson. He was civilian instructor. And when after I finished my course, I was went to school for 2 weeks to be an instructor. And all that amounted to was that I found out how to fly an airplane from the front seat instead of the rear seat. And Eddie Stinson was my instructor on that.
Fritz, after you were commissioned, what was your first duty assignment?
As an instructor.
At Kelly Field?
No, I was ordered to open up the field at Lone Oak, Arkansas.
Lone Oak, Arkansas.
Yes.
That's near Little Rock.
It's about 20 miles east of Little Rock.
Were you the post commander? The base?
Oh, no. No, I was just one of the pilots that was sent up there to start the instruction.
How many students about were on the field then?
Oh, about 200, I imagine. About 200 students arrived shortly after we did.
What type of aircraft?
We had the Standards and JN-4Ds.
The old four-cylinder Standard? What was so famous about those Standards?
They caught on fire.
They always would catch us on, like my Rolls Royce the other night?
Yeah.
Eventually then, I suppose, you junked them and went back to the...
Yes, after a couple of 3 months, they junked them, and we then got the JN-4s, and then we finished out the war with those.
How long were you at Lone Oak, General?
Well, I got right there in March 1918 to close the war in November.
Oh, then you weren't fortunate enough to get overseas during the actual war.
Unfortunately, I had no orders to go, and the war closed too quick. I was on my way to Hoboken when...
Oh, you were? And you recalled from your travel status and sent where?
Down to Love Field, Dallas, Texas.
And from Love, what was your next duty assignment?
Well, from Love Field, we went to Ellington Field, and...
well, that's at Houston.
At Houston.
By the end of the war, what was your rank?
End of the war?
Yes, sir.
The first lieutenant. I was promoted during the war.
You were promoted, good. Following your tour duty at Ellington Field, what was your next duty station?
Well, then we organized the First ALAC Provisional Bombardment Group at Kelly Field. And some of the squadrons that returned from overseas and reformed down there. And we carried on practice bombing at San Antonio. And until Mitchell got his project on the way, and elements of the group of the 11th and the 20th and 96th squadrons were ordered to Norfolk, Virginia, Langley Field, to participate in his bombing of the maneuvers.
Did you go direct from Ellington to Langley?
No, I was at the outfit was stationed in Kelly Field then.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. I remember that. You told me, and it was my fault. The bomb groups were at Kelly, and they were ordered to Langley. What was General Mitchell's project? You mentioned General Mitchell's project.
Well, he had, of course, an advocate of bombing of surface vessels, that he could do it and destroy vessels, and of course a lot of arguments by the Navy and I guess other people that he couldn't do it. And he kept on going until he finally secured enough airplanes.
Fine. General, we've just had a 5-minute break here, and it's a good time to start over because I'm particularly eager to hear all about the Billy Mitchell trials with the Navy. Did he have any trouble getting this set up? Did he have a lot of opposition in the higher echelons?
I presume that he did. Of course, I was a junior officer and never was in on staff meetings and so forth, but I'm quite sure that he had.
Were you? You were a pilot, though.
I was a pilot.
And what was your own aircraft that you were flying? What make?
An airplane that never heard of and never had any dealings with. It was F5L.
Who made it?
It was made in Canada, and it's a twin-engine seaplane.
Okay. General, let's start right at the beginning. I imagine that General Mitchell and you boys worked yourselves out a program of a different type of bombing at first and then got into another style. Could you tell me that you meant, I understood that he developed a regular itinerary of different types of bombing that gradually became more intense and heavier each day.
The whole program was set up to try to prove bombing, destroying surface ships, battleships, and also what effect it would have on the personnel on decks of a battleship. But in other words, you wouldn't destroy the battleship, but you see what effect it would have on the personnel operating the equipment, whether it would go out of commission or not. In other words, if you could kill a lot of the gunners or the people that are on deck, you know, or below deck, the concussions of bombs rather, what would happen to people that were down in the hull, you know, the bomb went off in the water right close to them.
These were things that no one knew about then.
We didn't know anything about anything like that. We had nothing that ever been accomplished like that before, you see. And he wanted to try all this out to prove his theory that an aircraft could destroy a navy.
What was the target vessel, or were there more than one target vessel?
Well, he had made arrangements to get several ships, surface ships. He got the Alabama, the old Alabama, and then the German aircraft, battleship, the Ostfriesland. And that was one of the heavily armored ships that they had in the German Navy. And that we were towed into over to the United States, and we put the Alabama up at the head of Tangier Island. And the Ostfriesland was about 80 or 90 miles off of Cape Charles out in the Atlantic Ocean. And that was the last part of the exercises on the Ostfriesland. But up to that time, periodically we started in with little personnel bombs on the Alabama, and then we moved into 100-pound bombs, and then we had 300s, and then 1100s, and then gradually went on up to, I think 1100 is the highest we used on that, but because the 2,000-pound bomb, we saved them for the Ostfriesland.
How many hours or days between each different type of test?
It would run sometime a week or 10 days.
Between each test?
Between each test, you know, sometimes longer than that.
Well, did you have witnesses? Were there newspaper people out on other ships?
Oh, yes,
Were they, I suppose the first 2 or 3 runs were in favor of the Navy.
Well, the Alabama, we didn't have so much of the newspaper coverage on that, but the Ostfriesland, that was covered extensively by all the services and the press and so forth. We didn't have radio or anything in those days, but we did have the press out there that went out.
How many runs did you personally make on the Alabama?
On the Alabama?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I think I made maybe 4 or 5 runs on the Alabama, but I wasn't using the F5L then. I was using a DH-4 airplane.
As the pilot, would you have a navigator and a bombardier and all those things like we're used to nowadays?
No.
Would you have to drop your own bomb?
Well, you take in the Martins. See, the Martins are the twin-engine Martins, what we use for the bombing, and the DH-4s, they had smaller bombs. They were the personnel bombs at 25 to 50 pounds. Mm-hmm. And then you'd have just your pilot and a bombardier. See, this
pilot and a bombardier. Mm-hmm. Were you boys in the Air Corps disappointed on the first few days of the runs? The small bombs, I guess, really made little effect.
No, because we knew what we were trying to accomplish, you know, and we knew we were not going to sink the battleship.
But I suppose you took a lot of ribbing because you didn't, from those that were opposed to you.
I presume that you call it ribbing. The Navy claimed we couldn't sink the ships, you know.
What was the ultimate outcome of the Alabama? Did it sink?
Well, we dropped 1,100 along the side of it, and it blew a hole through there that you could drive a Ford through, and I think that convinced them then that they didn't sink, though. They it was almost on bottom as it was, you know, see. And I've often wondered what they ever salvaged to get it out of there, because it was wrecked, actually.
Then you turned your attention to the Ostfriesland.
Well, our last exercise, of course, was the one out to sea, and that was, I say, 80 miles off Cape Charles, and so the day that we were going to do everything, I mean, we extend all of our effort and so forth. I think Josephus Daniels was Secretary of the Navy, and he had his ships out there that he went out on. And there's quite a lot of vessels out there, about maybe a mile away from the Ostfriesland. And we went out, and I wasn't bombing that day. I was running tail with my F-5L, which is a seaplane. I was going to, if anybody went in the ocean, I was supposed to land and pick them up. I was running safety. When we went out to sea, well, we got these seaplanes to run us on safety, you know, but it was a big airplane, and I had a pilot, and myself, I was pilot, co-pilot, and two crewmen, and a newspaper man was up in the front turret with a motion picture camera in his hand and so forth, you see. And this Martin bomber, you see here, that I showed you a picture of, was one that had a 2,000-pound bomb on it. And we got out there, and he made his circle, and in those days you had to bomb upwind, the primitive sights we had on the side of the aircraft, and you had to really be in the wind to get any accuracy at all. And we depended a great deal on these ships out there that was for their smokestacks, you know, but we always accused the Navy of banking their fire, so they cut down their smoke so we couldn't see.
Maybe they did.
Well, maybe they did, but that's a story they used to tell anyway. And, so we made the run. I was right back of the ship here that dropped the fatal bomb, as you might call it, because when he hit it, the time I got up to it, the battleship turned right over on its back, just like that, just almost, you could just see it just turn like that. And it went down then, nose first. Just kept right out of sight quickly, see? Well, that was all the show. And I could see all these ships, you know, steaming up and going home, going back to Norfolk, you see. Show was over with. And I guess we hadn't gone 15 minutes. And I was the last one. Everybody was ahead of me, see. I was bringing up the rear. And my right engine, the Liberty engine, just blew the whole camshaft right off of it, you know. And that old heavily water-soaked logged boat, I couldn't stay in the air, so I had to land out in the ocean with it. And I never landed in the ocean out there with the waves rolling 15, 20 feet high. And I never had any instructions on it, so I thought I would go down the trough first, and they changed my mind at the last minute. We was coming down all the time, you know, so we didn't have much time to make up your mind. But I finally landed hitting the crest of the waves, and I hit one, and I seemed like I hit a barren mountain. It just seemed to stop all of a sudden, you know. I thought we'd gone because I went down this way, and the wave was going over it, but she rode up over the top of it and down to the next swell, and that ended that, see. Well, the point of it is we were still 90 miles out in the ocean, and everybody was going home. We had no radio anyway to tell anybody that outside of a berry pistol, but they wasn't looking for that, and I could finally one of the boats came over close to me, and I think it was old Admiral Merrill's son was captain of this boat, and needed any help, and I said, "We sure do." Well, he said he'll send somebody for you. And about an hour later, we were getting pretty well filled with water because this thing had sprung the seams as wood hull, you know. And we had no way of no boat to get out on. We just had to jump out in the ocean. But he finally come alongside, and there was the old sandpiper, minesweeper, and he wanted to know if he wanted a tow. Well, I said, we'll try to salvage if we can. Well, he said, you fellows better get off, and so he sent a dory by the end of the wing, and we'd go out on the end of the wing, and each one of us jump off one at a time, because the boat's going like this, you know. Sometimes it'd be 10 feet before you hit the bottom of the boat, and by the time you get off. And so we finally all got off, and we got a tow line on it, and we started back to Norfolk then, and I think we were about 30 miles out of Norfolk, and we hit a kind of a squall and a storm, and the boat went up in the air, and the tow line broke, and she took water, and that's the last we saw. It went to the bottom.
What did the newspaper reporter think of all that?
Well, he wasn't on. Now, I was going to tell you right back in here, he was so scared he just wanted off. So when the first boat came over, one day, but he'd help, he said, let me off this thing. And they sent a dory over and got the newspaper man off of my airplane and put him on this destroyer.
Do you remember the date the Ostfriesland went down, approximately?
Oh,
it could be researched, of course, but
I had to go back, but I think it was in September, possibly the latter part of August, September of 1920.
Were you ever then, as a officer, called upon to testify for any congressional committee as to the effectiveness of bombing or anything?
No.
What was your rank while you were
First lieutenant?
You were first lieutenant while with General Mitchell. General, I know the 20s were lean years for those in the regular service. You were a regular officer, weren't you?
No, not at that time.
You were still in a reserve officer.
Yeah.
On what we call extended active duty. Those were lean years then for the Army during the 20s, because everyone thought that all wars had been ended. I'd like very much to pass on now to the great service I think you did for our country at Wright-Patterson when you were in charge of the development branch, and some of the things that you developed for the Air Corps that we now take for granted, such as goggles.
Well, back in the early days in the Air Force, the engineering and what we call the logistical section was combined under one command called the Materiel Division, and it was located in Dayton, Ohio. And under the Materiel Division, they had the Engineering Division, which divided up in the aircraft engines and what we call the Equipment Branch. And the Equipment Branch was charged with all the ground equipment, like landing field lighting systems and all of the things, and
oxygen masks.
Well, that comes that's the ground equipment I'm talking about.
Oh,
the
yes.
trucks.
I'm sorry.
All the gas mobile stuff for the servicing and that sort of thing, and landing lights for the fields. Then you had the aircraft branch, which had all the aircraft in it, and the engine. And then all the accessories went to it: the engine equipment, the engine instruments section, and the navigating equipment, and so forth. And then you had the clothing section, which you had all the parachutes and the clothing and the goggles and all that sort of equipment, boots and shoes and things that a pilot would wear. And these 4 or 5 sections all contributed to this thing what they call the equipment branch. And each one had their own engineering personnel qualified in, like in fabrics and parachutes, and the other in instruments, and the other in equipment, which they all work together.
That was probably along in the early 30s?
Yes, that was in the 30s.
You were probably, a major by then,
no,
Captain?
No, I was a captain then.
Who were some of your colleagues, names that are now as famous as yours at those days at Wright-Patterson?
Oh, there's practically a lot of them. There's Chidlow's and...
He's a 4-star.
Yes, and a lot of them, of course, have passed on, the famous ones. Jimmy Doolittle is still alive, I think, and Harmons, and there's quite a number of the fellows.
Incidentally, a little off the subject, the name Wright-Patterson, wasn't Patterson the man who had the cash register company?
Yes.
Is that how the name came?
Yes, one of their
The National Cash Register Company.
Yes, it's the family. I mean, a nephew, I think, or something.
Well, as chief of the equipment branch, I'd like very much for you to tell some of the trials and tribulations you had and breakthroughs. I remember once you told me of the first time you ever were able to successfully have altitude flying with oxygen and the goggles and things that would retain the oxygen.
Well, George, we had oxygen before, but the use of oxygen, of course, was pure oxygen, and the only way we had of getting it, I mean, to use it, would have one of these little wooden cigar things. You see the end of the cigars, what do you call them? You smoke on the end of a cigar, little nipple kind of a thing, and we stick that on the end of the tube, and you just hold it in your mouth, and as you just breathe it through your mouth, you see. That's
like a cigar holder in your mouth.
Yeah, just like a cigar holder, see. You turn the tank on with your hand down here, but
how about heat?
Well,
coldness.
Well, we had no heat in those days. I mean, the aircraft wasn't heated at all. We didn't have a hood on it. The hood came a little later. But one of the troubles we had was the oxygen when you went up 15,000 feet of freezing. You see the moisture in there, it would freeze. So you had to work with the commercial companies to get you dry oxygen, and that was quite a problem in the old days, is to get a manufacturer that could make breathing oxygen free of moisture. And that's one of the experiments. I mean, we're talking about experiments, no? We had to go through all that trial and error period to find out what was wrong, you know. We didn't get it, so some of the things we went through to get the breakthroughs, you call it, you know. And then one day I was flying around about 10,000 feet, and how uncomfortable this thing was, this nipple in my mouth, and I thought if we could just have a little mouthpiece come around here and feed up in here, and we could breathe it out. So I carved one out, a piece of sponge rubber, and I guess that was the first oxygen mask.
Yes, for the record, I know you're too modest, General. I had the good fortune to accompany you and a group of Oklahoma City civic leaders to Dayton when you presented to the Air Force Museum there some 3 years ago all of your original trophies and models and things such as that as a young officer you had developed. And I well remember that you presented, and it was accepted as such, and it's so labeled, the first master pilot model of the first mask that you, as you told me just now, you sort of made out of little spare parts and things.
Yes, that's quite true, and the same thing in the clothing. We had always still using open cockpits, you know, and we were using fur-lined suits made out of sheep shearling. And when the war, we got into the thing seriously, these suits, you know, were tanned and everything, but they had no waterproofing on them at all, and they absorbed water just like a sponge. In other words, if you happen to be out in the rain or anything, or going from your hangar to your airplane with your boots and your clothes on, you were soaking wet before you ever got in the airplane to go anywhere. So it was a problem of trying to find out how we could waterproof these hides. And I went up to the B.F. Goodrich Company and got with their engineering staff at Akron, Ohio, and got over to Dr. Fritz, who was the head of their research, and they had just developed a product called Corasil that looked very promising to do many, many things in the commercial field. And I asked Dr. Fritz whether or not he could take one of these sheep shearlings and treat it with this Corasil and see if we could waterproof it. Well, he said he thought we could, and I sent him up a half a dozen hides, and he treated the hides all right, and they were waterproof, but we found out it wouldn't stick. Well, we had to go all back through it and find out why this stuff wouldn't stick on this hide. And we found out that in tanning, that there was a certain amount of the natural oil in the skin left that they hadn't gotten out, that it wouldn't have made it easy there for this core seal. So we went back to the tanners and all through their story and got the hides and tan with no grease in them at all. So then it worked out that we could apply this material, and that's what saved us during the war, to all these flying suits and boots and so forth, was this core seal.
General, when did parachutes come in?
Oh yes, you asked about the parachutes. Parachute development was in the equipment branch, and I was responsible for the development and procurement of parachutes.
Somewhere I'd heard that the French took the lead on parachutes, or was it not true?
No, I don't. Never
General Irwin?
Les Irwin developed the parachute. I mean, he made the first live jump from an airplane.
Oh, he did?
And that was at McCook Field, back in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
No, McCook Field over at Dayton, Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Anything else about the equipment branch you'd like to tell us about before we pass on to World War II?
Oh, there's one item here that I see now after 30 years that the airlines are attempting or going to put in, and that is the fully automatic landing of an aircraft. 30 years ago, we developed one at Wright Field and the equipment branch, and we successfully landed an airplane completely automatic with hands off 30 some odd years ago. At that time, someone asked, well, what value is it?
Yes, I remember on a different angle on that point, when the class and traffic circle was put in, the people who didn't believe in it said that you could roller skate on it. There would be so little traffic whenever you use the class and traffic circle. And look at it today. General, tell us of your World War II. I'm very anxious while this tape yet is left to get on down to your part in locating what we now know as Tinker here.
Well, I was chief of the equipment branch 1939, and there's no doubt about it. I think General Arnold felt that the war was imminent, and he had us in and told us he thought we had 3 or 4 more depots in the United States. And being chief of the equipment branch, and all the depots were under my command at that time in the United States, and to go out and make a survey and see what should be done. He suggested one down in the south, around Mobile, one in Georgia probably, one out in Spokane, that area, and one under what we used to call the Babson Circle, out here in the Midwest,
yeah.
you know. And
for the newcomers, tell us what the Babson Circle is.
Well, that was...
Or was. That was Roger Babson.
Yeah, but somehow or other, the Chamber of Commerce in Oklahoma City got wind of this, or found out that there was such a thing being in existence, and so it wasn't very long that Mr. Draper was in Washington with Senator Thomas promoting coming out to Oklahoma City to look at some sites that they had options on for a flying field.
Well, I've heard you tell that you were ferrying planes across the continent.
Well,
and were intercepted, and tell us about that.
At that time, we was making deliveries on what they call an observational 25 Douglas out of the factory out of Santa Monica, and the pilots always kind of waited for your turn to be able to go out on a train and bring an airplane and deliver it to whatever station it was assigned to, and that was quite a little trip, and they're breaking the routine, you might say. And my trip came up, and I was on my way to California, and I think I was in Chicago when I was intercepted by a telegram saying, asked me to come to Oklahoma City to look at this airport signed Senator Thomas.
I know you've always said Senator Thomas interrupted your holiday.
Well, I got the telegram all right, but I didn't read it until I arrived in Santa Monica. I got my airplane, came on home and delivered it regardless, because I quite familiar with that part of the politics, how it works. So I had this mission to perform ahead of that, so I took our airplane and delivered it. And then, though it developed that I did come out here, and I brought a couple of other fellows with me, and we looked at the sites that they had here, one over on the other side of town, and one close to Will Rogers, but you couldn't get into Will Rogers because it's too close in there for the traffic. Have two airports too close together, and this had met the requirements that we had set up, and so we recommended that this land out here be purchased, secured rather, for the airfield.
Well, all of us in Oklahoma City are grateful for that recommendation.
I always got quite a kick out years later. Fred Jones evidently was nominated to go to Washington to kind of look this situation over, and he came back to the Chamber of Commerce, and Stanley Draper gave me a copy of a letter that he had the minutes of the meeting of the Chamber of Commerce new meeting, I guess it was, or something, in which Fred Jones said there's a colonel up at Wright Field by the name of Borum. Does anybody know him? He said he's going to have a lot to do with this, figuring out this airfield. If anybody knows him, we ought to get up there and get after this fellow, see? Mm-hmm. And years later, I received this communication, which is quite amusing to me now, that after all these years, to be presented with this
with the original document.
This original document about how they operated, you know, from the internal side down here in the community.
Well, again, sir, for the record, I want to, as former mayor of Oklahoma City, make it a matter of record that except for your help and the fact that you recognized the need, the base would not be here today. Wasn't it a source of considerable pride then to you later, as a Major General, to be ordered here as the base commander?
Yes, really it was. I had been overseas. Of course, I organized the Troop Carrier Command and commanded that and took it overseas during the war. And
that would be a tape in itself right there.
But I returned to the States in '44, and I had command of the Miami Air Depot. And one day I got a call from Dayton. Said, we want you out at Oklahoma City immediately. And so I packed up within 24 hours notice and came to Oklahoma City.
And you are also the only commander who has ever served two tours as base commander.
Well, of course, I was here at the close of the war. And then there was a great question what was going to happen to the place. And there's a lot of thought about, of course, of doing like they did with the plant in Chicago, which the three of them were built, Chicago, Tulsa, and here. What would be the ultimate use of them. And I had planned on originally with this building to convert it into complete engineering and move all of our engineering out of the wooden buildings, they're in 25 or 30 different odd buildings, into one building and concentrate all the efforts under one management, we might say. And that's what I had started to do, is to work up the program. And when I figured out it was going to cost about $1 million to do it, and I had to get the money out of Washington, of course, and that was hard come by, $1 million with the close of the war. Nobody was giving anything to anybody. And I can always remember that Secretary of War Patterson came through here in January of 1946. And he was on his way to the Philippine Islands when they had that little trouble over there, closed the war in the Philippines. And he gassed up at the place, and I was standing there on the ramp, and he looked over at the Douglas plant and he said, Borum, what are you going to do? What's going to happen to that building over there? So forth. Well, I said, sir, we have taken it over, the Air Force, and we're going to move in our engineering over there. Well, I thought the man would take off right then without his airplane, because he thought that was about the most silly thing he'd ever heard, and he didn't approve of it. And he was mad. He didn't say anything more to me. He got in his airplane, went to California. And Simonton was Secretary of the Air Force then. And I got a call from Simonton pretty quick. Said, "What are you doing down there, for heaven's sake? And I better come out there." And so Mr. Simonton came out. And showed him what we're going to do. And he agreed with me. And he said, "I'll go back and try to sell it." Sell the idea. But eventually, without going into a lot of details, that's what happened.
Incidentally, did you know, as I said, our host here this evening, Jordan Reeves, was in charge, General, of moving all of the equipment from the old places over into the new brick Douglas building. General Borum, we're very glad that we could have this. It's a great pleasure to me, particularly that you have decided to retire and live here among us in Oklahoma City. I'm grateful for the opportunity of making you part of the Living Legend Library, especially because you alone, more than anyone else, is responsible for the location of the old Midwest Air Depot. By the way, that name is where Midwest City gets its own name, that later became Tinker Field and then Tinker Air Force Base. I know General Borum knows it. Tinker is the state's largest industry. It employs some 38,000 people. The entire economy of Oklahoma is different because of General Borum's contribution in seeing to it that the old Midwest Depot, now Tinker, is located here. Thank you, General, on behalf of all of us in Oklahoma.
Thank you, George. It's nice to be with you.
In closing, General, did you know General Clarence Tinker?
Yes, very well. I was the executive officer for a period of time.
Where was his home?
His home? He was an Osage Indian, but he lived mostly in the eastern Washington.
He was killed during the war.
He was killed at Midway.
Midway. A Major General?
He was a Major General.
Yes, sir.
I don't want to say.
This is Joe Lauber. I am interviewing Mr. C.J. Kerwin on November 29th at the Ramada Inn. This is at a reunion of the ITIO, the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company. Mr. Kerwin, as we begin, let's go back and find out something about who you are and where you came from. Where were you born and when?
I was born in Denver, Colorado in August 1902. The reason for my being born in Colorado was the fact that my father was in the drilling business. He and my mother came from western New York, and he came west from Pennsylvania, West Virginia oil fields, and was working on a drilling well up at Boulder, and I was born in Denver.
Did you spend your childhood in Denver and go to school there?
No, as I say, my father was in the drilling business, and we followed him around, and I never went to the same school more than 1 year, all through my life up to high school.
Then you probably went to a variety of kinds of schools. Were some of them pretty small?
Oh, yes, in smaller towns, and but we moved up and down from the oil fields, went from Houston to San Antonio, Wichita Falls, and up into Oklahoma, and then back to Texas again, and finally started high school in Wichita, Kansas, because of the El Dorado, Kansas boom being on at that time, and went there 2 years, and then I went to Notre Dame University. At that time they had high school as well as college courses at Notre Dame. Well, I spent the last 2 years of my high school at Notre Dame, then went on through college there as a mechanical engineer.
So you spent 6 years at Notre Dame?
Yes.
And did you do any graduate work after that?
No, I didn't do any further scholastic work at all.
And you came out as a, did you say mechanical engineer?
Mechanical engineer, yes.
After you graduated from Notre Dame, what happened? Did you get married, and where did you go from there?
No, I didn't get married until, some 12 years later, but after graduating from school, I went to work for a steel company in Kansas City, and and worked there just a short time, 4 or 5 months, and came to Bristow, Oklahoma, and went to work for the Producers Oil Company in 1925.
In other words, you came to Oklahoma in 1925?
Yes, came to Bristow, and worked there at Bristow until 1930, and in 1930, in April 1930, I went to work for the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company at Oklahoma City.
And what kind of work did you do when you first came to the company here in Oklahoma City?
Well, I first started here as a roustabout in the production department, and after several months of that, I was given a supervision of some saltwater disposal plants. At that time, the field was producing some 25 or 30,000 barrels a day of salt water, and the intention was to pump it all to the South Canadian River, and through these saltwater disposal plants and a big line to the South Canadian River. But it was not too successful. There was just too much water, and so they ended up then letting the water go into the North Canadian River, and paying damage suits or claims to all the cities on down the river.
In other words, just plain salt water was just pumped raw right into the river?
Yes, it was just salt water that was being produced with the oil and gas.
Was there any way to get the salt out of that water, or has any way been developed since?
No, there hasn't, because there's so many other chemicals with the produced water that the only way to dispose of it is to pump it back into the ground, into old wells or wells specially prepared to receive salt water.
That's the way they get rid of it?
Yes, that's the way the only way it can be gotten rid of, because to let it run it out on the land or into rivers or into the ocean or any place, it's so corrosive, and so there's so many chemicals that it destroys practically all vegetation. And the only way to really get rid of it successfully is to pump it back into what they call saltwater disposal wells.
Well, then I imagine when they pumped it right into the North Canadian, there were a lot of suits, but were they cheaper than trying to get rid of it some other way?
Yes, that was the idea. It was cheaper than to dispose of it underground. Later in a number of years later, the state, Oklahoma, Kansas, all states, made very strict laws that the oil companies couldn't dispose of it in the rivers, had to dispose of it underground. But in 1930, we could dispose of water into rivers, but a great deal of farmland was destroyed, and a great deal of fresh water was made impossible for any use.
Has any of this farmland come back, or how long does it take for farmland to come back once it's been inundated by that salt water? Or does it ever come back?
Yes, it'll come back, but it may take as long as 25, 30 years, and then it's not too good at farmland. But much land was destroyed, and so the states made it obligatory that all producers of oil and gas have to dispose of salt water underground.
That's very interesting. Well, now we've got you to the Oklahoma City field, and in a supervisory capacity here. What followed next?
The Depression followed next, the deepest part of the Depression, and I, like everyone else, was fortunate, I suppose, to have a job. There were many thousands of men laid off here at Oklahoma City during the years from 1930 to 32, and but anyhow, I continued here, worked roustabout in various jobs, and in 1935 I was made a supervisor again as what was called a head roustabout, and Then about a year or so later, I got married in 1936. Married Cora Graff, who was a native from Mena, Arkansas, and was living here in Oklahoma City, working in Oklahoma City when I met her, and we were married in April 1936.
At that time, and at the time let's go back to the time you first came to Oklahoma City. What do you remember as the size of the city? What were the outlying limits of the city at that time, and then later in 1936?
Oh, I think when I first came here, the farthest south limits of the city were about 45th Street, 47th Street, and north it wasn't very much farther north than the capital, probably 29th, 30th Street north, and Lake Overholser was considered somewhat out of town. It was out of, maybe not out of the city limits, but it was quite a ways out there. And the east side of the city was probably not much farther than Eastern Avenue.
Well, it certainly has grown since that time.
Yes, very much, very much.
It seems from your description there that the city was considerably more south than it is now. Was Capitol Hill about the center of town at that time?
No, the center of town was in the old downtown area, but Capitol Hill was quite a booming suburb because of largely because of the oil field. See that during the oil boom here, I imagine there were some 5,000 or 6,000 men working out in the field, and quite a lot of them lived in Capitol Hill, or at least went through there every day. And the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company had about 2,500 men on the payroll during the boom here, and that was the reason for the growth of the city toward the south. Was the people who worked in the oil field built houses or bought houses or rented houses on the south side of town.
I see. Now, after you became head roustabout, what was the next thing that happened to you?
Well, about a year later, I was sent to West Texas for a short time to help supervise the drilling of a well in West Texas.
Was this with the same company now?
Yes, and but the well was a dry hole, and I came back to Oklahoma City and got married. And then not very long after that, I was made farm boss, which is the next step in foreman level, and was farm boss then here at Oklahoma City for about 2 years, 2 or 3 years, 2.5 years, and was transferred then to Great Bend, Kansas with the ITIO company as superintendent of production in western Kansas, and was there until about 1941 or 2, when I quit the Indian Territory Company and went to work for a British American oil producing company at Wichita Falls, Texas, and was there about a year, and then transferred to Tulsa and worked for a British American there in Tulsa until 1948, at which time I left them and went to work for Sunray Oil Corporation, and continued then working for Sunray in Tulsa until retirement in 1948, or 1967.
And you currently live in Tulsa right now?
Yes, yes.
What can you remember about the Oklahoma City field that might be unusual or different or interesting to anyone who is listening to this tape?
Well, I think the most outstanding thing about the Oklahoma City field was it was the first high pressure field. 2,000 pounds pressure was considered very high at that time. And all of the wells were flowing to start with, and some of them were enormous producing wells, that is, produced 35 to 40,000 barrels a day. And as a test of the well, at that time, some of the wells were allowed to flow that much. I remember seeing one well flow 40,000 barrels in 24 hours. Then it was shut in for 6 or 8 months to make because it had made its allowable or its production for a number of months. There were a number of wells, a lot of wells inside the city limits along Southeast 29th Street and in what is called the Lawrence Place addition, or it was called Lawrence Place. There were some big, enormous wells there that would flow at the rate of 8 to 10,000 barrels in 4 hours. The oil wells, all of them made lots of gas, and the gas was allowed to just blow wide open to the air, enormous waste of natural resources. And I think that is the thing that we can look back and see now how much gas was wasted, and the inefficient manner in which a reservoir was, an oil and gas reservoir was handled in the earlier days of the oil field, because at that time there was no proration, and the producers produced the wells to capacity and had very little respect for the reservoir itself.
Well, did the oil industry really realize the value of what they were wasting, or did that realization come later?
They realized it later. I think they knew that they were wasting it, but there was not very much of a market for gas, and gas was very cheap, 2 cents a thousand at the wellhead, and so it was considered a kind of a waste product like salt water and was just allowed to blow to the air.
Now they have to burn it off, don't they?
Well, no. All the gas is saved and put through gas processing plants, where gasoline or chemicals are extracted from the gas. Then the dry gas, after extraction of these chemicals, is transmitted through the transmission lines to for fuel, transmitted all over the United States. But there's no gas wasted now.
What are these flames that you see in the oil field coming out of these tall pipes?
Well, usually they're just temporary disposal of some excess gas, but it's not considered, it's not allowed really by some of the Corporation Commission inspectors to continue for a very long time.
Is that a low-grade gas, not a commercial gas?
No, it's commercial, but it's sometimes through certain processes, this gas may look like it's a lot of gas, but it's really not a very large quantity that's escaping. But the flame makes it look much larger than it really is.